Hey, it's good to see everyone tonight. We've got a good crowd out tonight, looks like. It's good to see everybody. It's been a busy weekend, hasn't it? You may be a little bit tired, huh? A little bit? No? No? Hey, we'll go all night then. Okay, yeah. Yeah, don't get close to them. No, we won't do that. I won't do you that way. John chapter 1, if you've got your New Testaments, let's go to John chapter 1. John chapter 1. The main point of our lesson tonight is going to be focusing upon the invitation that comes from Jesus and how great and wonderful that invitation is by virtue of the fact of the one who's invited us. So that's going to be a part of our main focus here in John chapter 1. I'm going to point out a few nuggets along the way here, but I hope that it won't distract from the main point. In John chapter 1, John writes, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through Him, and without Him nothing was made that was made." Now, the first thing that John is pointing out right here is something that I think and I hope that all of us know, and that is the deity of Jesus, that Jesus is God. And we're going to point that out in just a few minutes, a bit more. John is, at least. But I hope that all of us are very convinced, and our faith is built upon the fact that we know that Jesus is God. That was one of the hard things for the Jews at first to accept, that Jesus would actually be God in the flesh. They understood that there would be one who would come, he would be the son of David. They understood that he'd be the Messiah, the anointed one, spoken of, the suffering servant of Isaiah chapter 52 and 53. They at least had some rudimentary and elementary ideas about these things with regard to the coming of the one they looked forward to. By the way, Jesus, when he came into the world at the peak of the time in which the Jews were actually looking for the Messiah. There was a period of history with the Jews, and for whatever reason we don't really know, the Jews at that particular time were actually looking for the Messiah. And so at that time, the Sanhedrin, or the leaders of the Jews, said, "We're going to investigate each one of these so-called Messiahs." And so they would delegate certain individuals to go out, and the thing that they would look for would be miracles. Does he perform miracles? The thing that they would look for would be what are his claims? Does he claim to be the son of David? Can it be traced to be the son of David? And so forth. And there were just a couple of other things that they said that these were going to be earmarkings. And one of the things that they said would be an earmarking of the Messiah would be that he would be one who actually gave sight to the blind. And of all the false messiahs and all the tricks that they had back in those days to try to fool people, it was Jesus and only Jesus who came and actually gave sight to the blind. So John, in writing John, he really starts out right here in writing to the Jews, and this is primarily a Jewish book. And of course, we get our knowledge about Jesus from this as well, but he was telling them Jesus is God, referring back to the beginning. Now, it's interesting that he refers back to the beginning here, and he begins to talk about Jesus as being the light. Let's go on and read just a little bit. In verse 4, it says, "In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it." Now, that's the New King James Version and the wording of it, and perhaps maybe the King James Version as well. The word comprehend simply means that the darkness could not overtake the light. What happens every time a light goes on in a dark room? Well, darkness just dissipates. It's gone. Darkness is gone. You see, darkness cannot overtake light. Only light it always overtakes darkness. And I'm sure you've heard this illustration before, and maybe you've been over to Mammoth Cave over in our part of the country, and you've been in that dark cave, and at one point or time they will shut the lights out just to show you how dark it is. And I'm telling you, that is so dark. That is so dark, you could literally put your hand in front of your face. You cannot see your hand. You might feel the warmth of your hand next to your nose, but that's all. You cannot see it. And so then when they strike a match, that match, just the light of that match gives such illumination to that entire room. It's amazing how darkness flees when light enters into the picture. And so then John is telling us that when light came in, darkness could not overtake it. It's just a natural law. Darkness can overtake light. There was a man set, in verse 6, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. This man came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that through him all might believe. So let's talk about this in relation to the beginning, because there's a parallel right here that I'd like for us to see, and really I hope that it doesn't distract from my main point. But it does give emphasis upon the greatness of who Jesus is. He makes a reference back to the beginning. Now, what happened in the beginning? God said in the beginning, "Let there be light," and there was light. And then verse of chapter 1 and verse 16, after God had brought light into this physical realm, brought light into this physical realm. And by the way, he brought light into that physical realm, and how maybe he was that light. I don't know exactly what that light was, but it was light. And then he says in verse 16, it says, "Then God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and he made the stars also." The greater and the lesser light. John, in talking about Jesus, and he's going to be introducing Jesus as the light, taking this illustration and example back to the beginning, is setting up the fact that Jesus is the great light. John is not the great light. He is but a witness. Now, in our creation, what celestial or satellite do we have that is a witness to the sun that we see at night? The moon. The moon bears witness that as long as it's shining, you know that sun is giving light to the other side of the world, right? Okay, so the greater light and the lesser light. The lesser light is the witness to the greater light. John, in the similar way, he's drawing a parallel here. John, in this similar way, is saying that John the Baptizer is the reflection of the light of Jesus, but John is not that light. Without the sun, the moon would have no light. It cannot produce light. And in the same way, you and I cannot produce light without the greater light, Jesus. He is the greater light. We are merely reflections of that greater light. We do not produce the light. He does. And so in the same way then, John is not he does not have light within himself. Jesus is that light. He's the one who gives light. And John then, as he's mentioned here in the text here, is merely a witness, like the moon is a witness to the sun. You see the parallel that he's trying to make here? There is a parallel. Back in this day as well, the Jews were looking for parallels, and they were looking for patterns, and they often spoke in parallels and patterns. And we are in the churches of Christ have been taught to look for parallels and look for patterns, and that's good because it is a biblical way of learning. And so then he's pointing out to the Jews, hey, just as in creation, you have the greater light, you have the lesser light. John is the lesser light. He is the witness to the greater light. So then let's continue on now. I just wanted to kind of give you a little tidbit right there because it's just something that's a part of the text that the Jews would have picked up on that we might otherwise miss. All right, in verse 9, it says, let's back up to verse 8. He was not the light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which gives light to every man who comes into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. Now, this is where we want to pick up what we really want to talk about tonight, where it says that as many as received Jesus Christ, received the light. As many as received him, he gave the right to become children of God. This is an invitation. And a lot of times we look at that verse, and it is kind of a head-scratcher a little bit, and you're wondering, what is he actually trying to say here? What does he talk about giving the right to become children of God? We do need to be careful and not go so far as Calvinism. You may have heard of that term, Calvinism. It's named after a man by the name of John Calvin. And his belief was that God selected individuals to be saved and others by default were not saved. And so that was his view. Some, they believed, like, for example, if you went around this room, you picked every other person is saved. Just by default, though, the rest would be lost. That's his version. That's not what the Bible teaches. And so we need to be careful with this verse when it says that he gave them the right to become children of God. We need to be careful and not go there because that's not what it's saying. Let's look at it this way. The same one who is light is also King of kings and Lord of lords, right? All right, so he is also King. The same one who is being told to us right here is the light of men, is King of kings and Lord of lords. In Hebrews chapter 1, in fact, it's a quote. Go with me to Hebrews chapter 1. It's a quote from Psalms. It talks about his kingship. In fact, it talks about his deity. So we might just throw that in there as well. In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8, it says, "But to the Son," that would be Jesus, he, God, says, the Father, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness more than your companions." So this is the Father speaking to the Son. And the Father calls Jesus God. If you notice what the text is. The Father calls Jesus God. Jesus called the Father God. But what I want to point out here is the scepter of righteousness. Every king in the ancient times had a scepter. Now, it also says in Psalm chapter 2 that Jesus has a rod of iron, and he dashes into pieces the nations that rage against him. His enemies are dashed to pieces with that rod of iron. The scepter of righteousness, he rules with the scepter of righteousness his people. The rest of the world he rules with a rod of iron. All of those who refuse to be named by Jesus Christ, named to be his, those who refuse the privilege of being his children, unfortunately he rules with a rod of iron. But the scepter of righteousness is for those of us who are children. And what does he do? Now, let me back up here just a little bit. The scepter of righteousness also acts as an approval of the acceptance of invitation. Let me reference that with you and to you to Esther chapter 5 and verse 2. Esther chapter 5 and verse 2. You remember that account when Esther went before her husband the king, and she was afraid. She was afraid. When you went before a king, and if the king did not lower his scepter, that meant you were not welcome into his court. See, she was outside of the court of the king. He was sitting upon his royal throne. She could not enter into his presence. You could not just walk into the presence of a king and chat. You had to be invited, and that invitation came by way of the lowering of the scepter. And so when that scepter was lowered, she touched the end of that scepter. It was an acceptance of the invitation. So when you go back to John, it says here in John that as many as received him, he gave the right to be children of God. That's what this is actually referring to, is that he has lowered the scepter to those who are willing to receive, willing to accept, willing to believe, willing to obey, willing to become one of his children. And so it is a lowering of the scepter. In the Old Testament, there is the tabernacle. I know all of you you've read about the tabernacle, and how that the tabernacle is in two compartments. One compartment is a completely square cube. The other compartment is sort of a little bit longer, and it's called the holy place. And then inside that cube, behind the veil, is the most holy place. All right, that's where the Ark of the Covenant is. And on the Day of Atonement, that's also where the altar of incense is placed. The altar of incense is actually carried into that place. That's the one day and the only day in which that is carried into the most holy place, because incense had to be burned there. But no one could enter it just on a whim. You could not just enter in the most holy place. So on one day, the inauguration day of the law of Moses, the very first day in which all the sacrifices and everything was to be inaugurated, it's supposed to be a day of celebration. It turned out to be a day of grief and sorrow and pain, because there were two sons of Aaron that just marched right into the most holy place. And they grabbed, first of all, they had incense. They had used fire from a place other than where God had authorized, which was the altar. And the two of them went right in there. And we know the story, if you've read it in Leviticus chapter 10, the Lord killed them right there, burned them up. And Aaron was told not even to grieve over the loss of his sons. That's how serious it was to enter into the presence of a king, and that was an illustration of the seriousness to enter into the presence of a king. Mount Sinai is another illustration. And even if an animal touched the mountain of Mount Sinai, they were to strike down that animal. So you see the seriousness, and so then what we have here is we have Jesus, who is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, lowering the scepter and saying, I accept your presence. When he died, it was his blood that he took into the most holy place that was not made with hands, according to Hebrews. And by his own blood, he sanctified that holy place, that most holy place, so that that holy place and that most holy place became one place. One. Not two any longer, because that veil of separation had been taken out of the way, which represented our sinfulness. And so then, now, because Jesus has taken away the sin problem, and if we have, by virtue of obedience of faith, accepted what he's done, and of course we've been talking about and have to talk about how that's done, is that through obedience of faith is when we are baptized in the name of Jesus Christ, we arise and walk in newness of life. That sin problem for us has been taken care of. That penalty has been taken care of for us. We do not have to suffer the penalty that was due us because of it. So then the scepter now has been lowered. And we are always in the most holy place. That's where we live now. You and I are, in our existence spiritually, is in the most holy place. You never step out of it. As long as you're walking in the blood. As long as you're walking in the light. 1 John chapter 1. As long as you and I are walking in the light, as he is in the light, we never step out of the most holy place, ever. So now, let's continue to read here in John chapter 1. Let's go back to John chapter 1. If we continue to read here, we're going to notice a couple of other things. One, he's pointing out that Jesus is greater than the creation because he made it. Number two, he's greater than John, the prophet, who came and who was the harbinger of the coming of the Messiah and the one who introduced Jesus, the Messiah, to the people in Jordan. The third thing is that he's even greater than Moses. He's even greater than Moses. Now, this was all important, remember now. I'm trying to stay in line with our point. It's important. This is important because, you see, Jesus is the one who is giving the invitation to be in his presence. Not Moses, not John. It is Jesus who's giving the invitation to be in his presence because he's the king. So then, let's just jump down to verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory is the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. When Jesus became a man, a human being, he's still God. He's still God. The expressions of his deity he may have set aside. Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. He may have set those aside. As a human being, Jesus was not able to be everywhere at the same time, which is an expression of his deity. And so he limited himself in that way, but nevertheless was God. By the way, let me say this. The expressions, when somebody asks the question, what makes God God? The answer to that question is never his attributes. What makes God God is just that He is God. All of His attributes and qualities are because He's God. They don't make Him God. The quality of being able to have His eyes upon all of creation at one time, that does not make Him God. That is a quality because He's God. The fact that He can be everywhere at the same time, that's a quality of God, but that doesn't make Him God. He is God, and therefore that is the expression of His deity. So that's very important to remember, that Jesus could actually empty Himself of the expressions of deity, become completely human, become a little helpless little baby. God could become a helpless little baby in the arms of His mother, and all He's interested in at the moment is feeding and being changed, you see, and still be God in the flesh. The attributes do not make Him God. He is God, therefore we have the expressions of that deity. So in verse 15, John bore witness of Him and cried out, saying, "This was He of whom I said, He who comes after me is preferred before me, for He was before me." Now, John knew something right there. John knew something, that Jesus is greater than him. He is. Jesus is greater than John. John knew it. I don't know how John knew this. Maybe it was just inspiration speaking, the Spirit speaking through John. Sometimes the prophets spoke and they didn't quite understand at the moment why or what they said. But John understood that Jesus is greater. And he says, "Of His fulfillment we have all received, and grace for grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." He's not comparing the law of Moses to the law of Christ here. What he's saying is that just as Jesus is greater than the creation, John would say He's greater than I am, the prophet. He is even greater than Moses. He is the only one who is qualified to offer the invitation to lower the scepter and to invite us into His presence. He is the only one. Now, let's look at the invitations. We're going to jump a little bit. We're going to jump to verse 35. Then this is after Jesus is baptized and the Spirit descends upon Him and remains upon Him, in fact. John points out on that particular day that, "Behold, this is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." John's going to say that and make that confession again in verse 35. Again the next day, John stood with two of his disciples, and looking at Jesus as He walked, he said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." And his two disciples heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. And verse 38, it says that Jesus turned, and seeing them following, He said to them, "What do you seek?" And they asked Him, "Rabbi," which is to say, in translated, teacher, "where are you staying?" He said, "Come and see." There's your invitation. There's your invitation. Come and see. Here we have the Messiah. Here we have the King of Kings. Here we have two individuals that are seeking Jesus, and Jesus gives the invitation, first invitation, come and see. Now we continue to read. One of the two heard John speak and followed him, and was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. Verse 40. He first found his brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which is translated the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. And when Jesus looked at him, He said, "You are Simon, the son of Jonah. You shall be called Cephas," which is translated a stone. And the following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." There's invitation number 2. Invitation number 2. Remember, this is going back to chapter 1, where Jesus is the only one that can give the invitation to follow Him. The only one who is qualified, the only one who can lower the scepter and give us the right to become children of God, give us the privilege to become children of God. And immediately we have invitations coming. Come and see. Follow me. Verse 44, now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. And Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." So really, that's your third invitation right there, but I want you to notice how this invitation came. Because what's interesting about this one is that you have Philip who was invited where the Lord said to him, "Follow me." There's his invitation. So he does. So then what does Philip do? He extends the invitation now. That means then that we as Christians, if we've come to Christ through obedience of faith, what does God give us? The right to invite. We have the right to invite. We have the right. The Lord invited us through His Word and by way of invitation, by way of the gospel, by way of virtue of who He is, the King of kings and Lord of lords. He's lowered His scepter. So we have touched the scepter by obedience of faith. We have touched the scepter. Now, we have been given the privilege to invite others and say to them, "Come and see. Follow Him." So that invitation now is extended and multiplied, over and over and over. So then it's not very surprising then when we come to the Great Commission, that the Great Commission says that He says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations," not just in Somerset, not just in Kentucky, not just in the United States, all the nations. Because that invitation has been given to us, and we are therefore privileged to be able to extend that same invitation to anyone else. I hope that you all feel free to be able to invite friends and family to worship here. And I'm certainly going to do my best to make that invitation that you extend one that is worthwhile, one that's where you're not going to be afraid of what's going to be said from the pulpit, one in which you're going to be afraid that maybe your friend or your loved one, your neighbor, or your family member may be offended by something that is said that shouldn't have been said inappropriately. I hope that you will feel free to do. You've got to have an environment to do that, really. You have to have that kind of environment. And so I'm going to do my best to be able to set up that environment. The pulpit sets the tone for the church, I was always taught. The pulpit sets the tone. We want to make sure that that tone is an inviting one, that we can invite people to be a part of us and fill up every pew in this building. All right. In that, we have had the privilege of being invited by the calling of the gospel. We have that opportunity again this evening, that great privilege to be called by the gospel of Christ. The scepter has been lowered, and if there's anyone here that needs to put on Christ in baptism, I want you to know that Jesus has already made it possible for you to become one of His children, and all we need to do is simply to respond. And there might be another reason why that you might need to express your need this evening. And I just want to invite you, and talking about invitations, I want to invite you to come as we stand and sing. Our glorious army.